Hi everyone, my name's Sam from Friends of the Earth. You might be thinking, why someone from Friends of the Earth here? But I also have a side career in explaining cumulative rules of origin to people on Twitter. So I think that's what's led to me being here. I've actually worked
perpetual.
Yeah, so I've actually worked on trade for quite a long time. There used to be a joke. I was working on TTIP that you used to get levelled at me and perhaps Ali, which was there was the hashtag worked on trade before TTIP, and that was a negative thing towards it. But now we get to say that we worked on trade before Brexit, which is quite nice. And actually, in the lead up to the referendum, I remember being on a panel somewhere, and an agitated young man stood up in the audience and pointed at me and said, "You only want to stay in the European Union because you want to keep your job." And I looked at him and said, "I work on trade. If we leave, I'm going to be in work for the next 10 years. I'd now amend that to say I'm going to be in workshops for the next the next 10 years. But it's certainly a silver lining in terms of we get to have really important, substantive discussions about trade here in London now. So I no longer have to go on the Eurostar so much. So it's quite good. And so we're here today to discuss what are the priorities in UK trade negotiations, which I think is a really good question. I have opinions, but I'm not sure that the government quite knows yet. We get long lists of countries, New Zealand, Australia, Ghana, US, but we get very little on strategy, substance and sequencing. And I'm hoping today we can go into that a little bit. And it's particularly for me, something that's been under-discussed so far, although it was mentioned in the session before, is the importance of non-tariff barriers to global trade. And from an environmental perspective, this is where I come in. And for all that was said about TTIP, and as Ali will know, I've got lots to say about TTIP given the time. I think at its heart, it was an attempt to bring together the two regulatory superpowers of the world in an attempt to find commonality so as to face off against the rising East and the third global regulatory superpower to be in China. And they failed. But this leads me to some questions about the UK's future place in all of this. And I've got three, and maybe they'll be addressed by the speakers, maybe they won't. As I said, I was quite a late addition in terms of being a chair. But my first is, will the UK prioritise remaining aligned from a regulatory perspective with the EU in the future, or will it perform a transatlantic pivot and gradually realign with the US? And from the US perspective, will they see Brexit as an opportunity to eke big concessions from the UK so as to increase their leverage over the EU in future negotiations? And from the EU's perspective, will it attempt to bind the UK to its regulatory acquis so as to see off the threat of the US overtaking them as the global regulatory superpower? And the answers to these questions have implications far beyond trade. It goes into, it's why in the environment sector we're interested. And so far, it's just not been very much discussed, and it would be nice if it was. In terms of the panel today, I'm going to stop speaking now. We've got a great panel. We've got Ali Renison, Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. Ali's someone that, over the last 3 years, I think we've found ourselves on the opposing side of arguments up until Brexit, where we now seem to agree on quite a lot. And I think it's fair to say that in terms of people who have traipsed around the country finding out the implications of Brexit on different sectors, Ali's probably done more legwork than everyone else in this room combined. So I'm looking forward to hearing from her. Then we've got Professor Gabriel Felbermayr. Good. From the University of Munich and IFO. I'm sure you all know IFO, but I remember them. They did an early study on TTIP that projected some very huge gains that then became very controversial. But I'm looking forward to hearing from Gabriel on Europe, and then Professor Jim Rollo from Sussex University, and I think you're the Deputy Director of the Trade Policy Observatory.
I am.
I'm not, in terms of order, I think I'm going to go from left to right. So, Jim.
So I'm going to start, right?
Yes.
I thought I was going to finish, but there
okay,
we are.
what order were you told you were going to be in? Because we can do that as well. There was no
it doesn't matter.
indications.
It doesn't matter. I'll start. I didn't get time because of a couple of other things, mainly the director being in Australia and things falling to me that I'm not well designed to deal with. So I don't have a presentation per se on this. And what I'm going to talk about is a little bit the mechanics of the choice issue as it confronts the UK vis-a-vis what we used to call third countries. But let me start by saying that, as far as I understand it and can see, we face three different sets of negotiations. The first one is with the GSP countries, the Generalized System of Preferences countries, with whom the EU has an agreement with 92 countries. This includes 49 least developed countries, for whom we have something called everything but arms, which means that they get duty-free, quota-free entry for anything except arms, guns and whatever. It was once jokingly called the Venus de Milo initiative when it was under consideration. The trick about this one is that it is actually not reciprocal trade. They are given preferences, but they give no preferences in return. And as well as the 49 countries covered by the EVA, the remaining countries have different levels of preferences across a selection of goods. These are not complete agreements. And these are seen as, and these are embedded in the WTO agreements, and while they're not a compulsory requirement on us to have a GSP as such, it seems to me that we have such an agreement now. We have encouraged the EU over the years to make that agreement as liberal as possible, and that's mainly meant playing about with issues like rules of origin, which is another issue for, to some extent, this story, this panel this morning. The important thing about the 92 members, who are the 92 countries that are party to this agreement, is, of course, that they're all WTO members as well. So diplomatically, it seems to me this is an important group from a British perspective. These are countries that it would do us, we would be wise to at least be on good terms with, if not necessarily being more generous than we're being at the moment under EU rules. I myself would think that the first thing we have to do with these countries is to tell them that nothing will change on day one of Brexit, that they will get exactly the same treatment as they currently get from the EU 28, and therefore they can start planning on that. But to say perhaps that in the longer term, this would be my preference, not necessarily British preferences, particularly under current management, that we might offer some things which help liberalize and ease the costs of doing trade. Again, particularly in the area of rules of origin, but I'll come back to, I can come back to that in questions. Because just to hark back to the WTO story for a moment, I think we have to do that first, and not least because the EU will want to know what our WTO story is before they do a bilateral with us of whatever kind that bilateral turns out to be. So therefore we need plenty of allies in the WTO to make sure that we don't trip up over taking back our full responsibilities for our WTO schedules and so on. There are some tricky issues there around questions of quotas, but also I think the government's going to possibly find out that its agricultural policy is partly determined by the rules of the WTO, because the Uruguay round agreed a set of an agreement on agriculture which included disciplines on expenditure of trade distorting subsidies and complicated methods of defining what's trade distorting and what's not. So that's the first group. And there's no reason why we can't be talking to them now, because all we are going to say to them, and I would, under my scenario, is we're just going to keep things as they are in the short run. We'll have a discussion over the following 5 or 10 years about where we go next. In the meantime, please be nice to us in the WTO, or words to that effect. So that's one. The second, Tom has already spoken about the 53 countries in whatever it is, 32 agreements that we already have an FTA with through the EU, and which, again, as Tom has pointed out, represent about 10% of our exports. So, you add that on to what the 44% or whatever that goes to the EU, and again, you're picking more than 50% of our exports, and more than 50% of our, nearer 60% of our imports. And it's worth remembering in a group that's mainly economists that we usually think of trade policy as being about imports, not about exports. Exports are simply what we need to pay for our imports. But that's not necessarily the way people are thinking currently. And then there's the question of new FTAs. FTAs with people the EU has not got, or countries the EU has not got FTAs with. Now, 6 months ago, you might say, well, TTIP's somewhere coming down the track. There's actually been signed one of the mega regionals, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You might have said that we could go and talk to the Japanese, who are writing an agreement with the EU at the moment, and get alongside them to be prepared to deal with that. I'm afraid Mr. Trump's turned that over a bit. We haven't got a TPP. Now, TPP augured to be probably the most liberalizing agreement outside the EU. It was better than NAFTA. It's supposed to be better than NAFTA and any of the other attempts at deep agreements. But it's really quite hard at this. And Australia and New Zealand are both negotiating with the EU. Something that probably 2 years ago we would have thought was not likely, now looks really quite likely. And the other point that comes out as a practical point is that it's unlikely that the Australians and the New Zealanders will be too keen to complete an agreement with us before they've completed an agreement with the EU. And again, we ought to be a little bit cautious about rushing into agreements with countries that are in negotiation with the EU, because if they do a deal with the EU, that will be a much bigger market, and that will be a determining issue in their attitudes to how they look at the UK as a potential partner. Now, the other end of the telescope, so to speak, on this is a question about what our strategic interests are. And it seems to me, basically, there are four issues, well, maybe really just two issues coming together. First point is just to always remember, I mean, we've said it several times, but I don't think you can say it often enough. 80% of our GDP is services. Not quite half of our goods and services are services export, services trade, our goods and services trade are represented by services. The other bits of our trade is more or less complex manufacturing. One thing we know about services is that they're governed by regulation. They're not governed by trade tools at the frontier. So regulation puts its head above the parapet there very quickly. Tom noted I was happy enough to be giving evidence to the House of Lords on TTIP at one point. And a former Chancellor of the Exchequer said, and are we going to do a really liberal financial services deal with the US? And Simon Evenet, I'm glad he did it, was very was very happy to tell him that actually the Americans and the American regulators had said no to any transatlantic financial services deal. For the first time, I saw shock and horror run around a room at that point, because they thought that was the big deal to be had for the Brits in this. And then the other half of this, the complex manufacturers, we've heard a bit about, quite a lot about that from Nigel so far, but it just says that again points us to the standards area and to the value chains area. I mean, services are part of value chains. The other sort of 50% you might want to say about the nature of our exports of goods is that in value-added terms, about 50% of that is services. Now, these are all things that used to be done inside the factory walls that have now been outsourced to accountants and whoever in it all, but nonetheless. So it seems to me that in looking at these other agreements, these agreements with these new FTAs that we are not currently already part of through the EU, then what we're looking for very much is very deep agreements. We're going to want services to be included to a very considerable extent. We're going to want probably something like mutual recognition of testing and certification. This is a bit technical. It's an issue. It's going to arise if we have if we leave the single market. Conformity assessment is a nightmarish subject. But I think the key point to remember is it's not what our regulations are that are so important. What the mutual recognition is of our conformity assessment mechanism can identify and certify that any good meets EU standards or US standards. It's not that it's a harmonization of standards. That might be a right way of going ahead, but even if we had that harmonization outside what we have now of the chapeau of EU law, I mean, our standards at the moment are determined by the direct effect of EU law. That's why we have no conformity assessment at the frontiers on intra-EU trade. Even if we remained in the customs union, we would still have to go through a conformity assessment story if we are outside, because we are no longer governed by EU law in what we do. And what our standards are. And it will still be up to some foreign customs officer, whether he or she be French or US, to determine whether they're convinced by the certification that you bring and show them. So it's not anything we do in this story that generates the costs, although the cost of certification are there and really enough. So we want to get through and minimize those sorts of costs as far as possible. We may want to, in the context of value chains, want to minimize the impact of rules of origin and try and negotiate fairly generous rules of origin. I can't see generous rules of origin being high up the Trump agenda. In this, of course, I mean, there's a question about whether his advisors know what rules of origin are, but we wouldn't expect him to anyway. But or any president for that matter, can't be a good use of a president's time to know about those. So those sorts of priorities are there. The second thing to say about our priorities is, well, of course, the biggest gains are going to be where the biggest barriers are. Because we're trying to remove barriers in this story, and it's obviously is obvious that that's true, but it's again worth reminding oneself of that. And it's relatively easy to see where we are with tariffs, and the numbers are not high for any of these countries. Typically, they're below an average tariff of 5%. There may be important tariff peaks, which it's one of the jobs of DIT to identify, in these negotiations, but that's fairly straightforward stuff. I mean, I think the regulatory barriers and how we reduce the costs of meeting them or even reducing them are important. This is important for services. There's a bit of competition going on in trying to measure services barriers at the moment, but I'm going to use the World Bank numbers on that, but that's simply because my colleague Ingo Borchet is part of the World Bank team that's generating these, so loyalty requires that I use them rather than the OECD ones. It's really noticeable that pretty well for all of the countries we're looking at, apart from perhaps New Zealand, the so-called services trade restrictive indices, which measure the amount of trade excluded by the regulation, are somewhere between 20%, somewhere around 20% in most of the developed countries. The EU towards external is about 0.25 or something, so 25% of trade excluded. There's a trick in this that one has to just remember, however, when looking at these sorts of regulatory issues, which is that regulations have a purpose. They're not just there to be barriers to trade. I mean, I prefer to think of them as obstacles to trade, i.e. something that comes out of the natural functioning of a society and the state. So there's some minimum level below which they won't be able to be reduced. And what we're looking for is a least trade distorting number there. So I think that's another set of issues that we need to be picking over very at the moment. I mean, if the backroom people in DIT are not worrying about these sorts of issues at the moment, we're not going to pick up and run with this ball, which we can't do an extraordinary amount about ahead of in the next 2 years. We have to begin most of this after the next after we've finished the negotiations with the EU on exit. It seems to me. So what would I think there are other things that you might want to you have to think about in the context of our prioritizing. Clearly, the size of the country, the size of the economy, the size of the market is an important issue for all of us. The barriers I've talked about, deep, again I've talked about in that context. But there are other things too. Ease of dealing with your partner's underlying structures. So legal systems, language. I mean, it's easier clearly to deal with people who are, to 99% speaking the same language. So that really points quite strongly towards the Anglosphere as the sort of place why not to be beginning. Because, as I say, legal system is familiar-ish. It's not the same. There will be traps out there. But it's not probably quite as difficult to understand as, let's say, the Korean legal system in this context. There's someone we are going to have to probably negotiate with, because I can't believe the Koreans will allow us to just continue grandfathering through the existing EU agreement, just wipe out EU right in UK sort of approach. Working. Okay, I'm just about there, I think. In this. I think the other question which no one's talked about at the moment is just the pay and rations bit of this whole story. I mean, even a simple negotiation with 92 countries, one in which you basically tell them what you're going to give them, and maybe wrap it up a bit better than that, is going to be very people intensive. And there's not the sign yet that Department of International Trade is tooling up in terms of just numbers of people on the ground. So I think it's going to be difficult. I think we would do well to start with smaller countries, more like us. So the Australians, the New Zealanders, who are both very effective and very canny trade negotiators. So it won't be a pushover by any stretch of the imagination. But if we make mistakes, they won't be big ones. I mean, that's the other point one might want to say in this. You know, making a mistake with Mr. Trump could be quite difficult. So I think, you know, I would push the US down the track a bit, though I can see the political attractions of doing it quickly. But let me stop there.
Thank you. Okay, Gabriel.
Yeah. So first of all, let me thank the organizers for having me. These are exciting times for trade economists. So we're back in business. 5-6 years ago, it looked as if we would, work about, micro level data on firms, understand what firms are doing and globalizing markets. But trade policy issues are back big time. So that is a good side. Of course, I'd rather not talk about Brexit and about all these other things that are looming large. Talked about Donald Trump and his trade agenda. But well, here we are. Now, I was asked to say something about the European perspective, and I'll try to do so. And I'll start from the very large picture, and then go down and end up with a German perspective, and then maybe also with my own perspective and my institute's perspective. So Europe has a very ambitious trade policy agenda. We've heard they have 32 agreements already with many countries, and there is a lot of stuff being negotiated right now. So the biggest agreement that could actually be signed this year is the one with Japan. Shinzo Abe comes to Germany in a couple of days to open the CeBIT Hanover Trade Fair. Maybe we'll hear some breakthrough there, but that's one. There are many others that are being negotiated. The GSP system that Jim has referred to is going to be replaced, at least partly, with economic partnership agreements that still satisfy this special and differential treatment idea of non-reciprocity, but goes closer to being normal trade agreements. We will see negotiations with Turkey to deepen the customs union or to solve the problems that exist there. Similarly, there's discussions with Mexico. There's an EU-Mexico trade agreement already in place. It's going to be modernized as well. Mexico has a trade share with the United States that's very, very big. 81% or so of their exports go to the United States. Given the recent developments, I think it's very clear that they're eager to go forward with the EU. There's discussions with India that have been difficult for the last years, but who knows what's going on there. Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so forth. So it's a large agenda. And of course, what's happening there will have very direct effects on the UK's trade agenda. So the UK has been indirectly through the Commission in negotiations with India for many years, or with Mercosur in South America for many years. So what has been conceded there or discussed there is hard to take off the table again. The EU has a trade strategy, or something they call it trade strategy. So there was the Global Europe Strategy from 2006. It has partly been superseded now with a Trade for All strategy that it has been, in a sense, reframed given the discussions about TTIP. But if you read these documents, you don't learn a lot about the EU's real objectives or priorities in trade agreements. I would say the water? Glass. Yeah. Sorry. So I think the lesson that we have to learn from what we have seen with the TTIP negotiations or the CETA ratification process is that the EU doesn't actually know itself what its priorities are. So if you ask for the EU trade policy priorities, I'm afraid they are very hard to identify. We have 27 EU members with partly very different priorities, very different levels of development. When you go from Bulgaria to Luxembourg, there's an enormous amount of heterogeneity. The traditions towards free markets, interventions of state, the role of the government relative to the economy are very different, and so I think Europe has become increasingly a difficult negotiation partner over the last years, and the CETA ratification process shows how that can go. With now trade agreements declared mixed trade agreements, meaning that 27 EU member state parliaments have de facto veto rights over those agreements, and there are even some provincial parliaments that are involved in the process as well. You've all heard about the Wallonia hold-up in the CETA ratification process. So that's the situation. It's very complicated, and the EU is itself in a process of redefining what it stands for, and that, you know, the Brexit phenomenon is part of this phenomenon, and it's very hard to see where this is leading to. Just a couple of days ago, we had the French, the German, I think the Italian government present a paper on a Europe of multiple speeds of integration, whatever that should mean. But to the extent that we don't know where the EU is going, it's very hard to say what the EU is standing for in terms of its trade policy priorities. Now, there are certainly two camps when it comes to the Brexit. There is the camp that is maybe represented by people like Barnier, by people in the European Commission, also in the European Parliament, in some member states, who would pursue, let's say, a tough Brexit, a Brexit that makes sure that the UK economy looks worse after Brexit than before, to make the case clear that for other would-be exiteers from the EU, it's a good idea. It's a bad idea to do so. And there are movements, as you know, in many other countries, and many other member states of the EU, where arguments that have led to Brexit in Britain are also gaining political importance. That's true in Denmark, for example, in Sweden, in the Czech Republic, in France, of course. Yes. To make the case that exiting is costly could mean that the European Commission will make it very hard for Britain to secure a soft deal and an advantageous one. But there's a second camp as well. Maybe the business interests are more represented there. Maybe it's also the more market liberal countries like Germany, some of the Eastern European countries. But there's the migration topic that looms large, of course. But there, I think the idea is more to provide a more conciliatory agreement with the UK. In Germany, it's often heard that if we ask for a very tough solution with the UK, it reduces our own option to issue a threat of our own exit. No, so we will see with Britain out of the EU, we'll see that the majority voting system will be changed quite significantly. So we have this 35% of population blocking minorities so far, and very often Germany, UK, Netherlands, Austria, Luxembourg, often Slovenia, so a couple of smaller countries, but Germany and the UK had a veto over, let's say, less market-friendly policies that often come from the Club Med or from France. That veto right will go with British exit, so Germany's position will be weakened, and that means that Germany will look towards its own exit option with more interest. Not that anyone talks about exiting the EU in Germany, but it's the ultimate threat point. And if if we make the EU exit a disaster for Britain, it makes it much less credible for Germany itself to threaten an exit on its own. Now that's theory, but I think, and it's a remote possibility, but I think it's important to understand the position of the German government. There is no official position yet, no, but these two arguments exist: the punishment to avoid further secessions, but and on the one hand side, on the other side, the idea that a credible exit option is important to avoid being exploited by other EU members in a system where decisions are made based on a majority rule, and where you can be where you find yourself in a minority position. Now, going down to the German situation, I think the business community has made it very clear that they will respect what they call a Primat der Politik, so a political primacy or so. So they don't like the idea of the Brexit, of course, but similarly to the EU's policies with Russia, where they have adopted something very similar, they say, we don't like what's happening, but we give priority to the political imperatives rather to the business imperatives. Now, how much of that is just words, I'm not sure, but it is a fact that the big business lobbyists, the big interest groups in Germany have not said very much about Brexit yet. They've not come forward with any proposals, for example, like the German Federation of Industry, the BDI, or other bodies. Now, I think what people do understand in Europe is that the Brexit is Brexit. I think Theresa May has made this very clear. There are people like myself who thought that Brexit could be avoided maybe at the end of the day, but that doesn't. I think people are less and less believing that this is an option. Now, if Brexit happens, what will it be? It will be probably exiting the customs union. I don't see how that can be avoided. I mean, it's true there's no good economic case for that, but on the other hand, if you want to be in the customs union but you have no political representation, this is going to be very, very difficult. And we have an example of a country which is in the customs union, but not in the European Union, which is Turkey, and they are utterly unhappy with this arrangement. It's inherently asymmetric. Whenever the EU negotiates with a third country, that external member in the customs union has to mimic what the EU is doing, and often the third country is not willing to enter in these negotiations. TTIP is just a case to show that. The second thing that will happen is probably the exit of the single market because of this country's unwillingness to accept the easy chase decisions, and the third point is of course migration. Now, what is, I think, very important from the German perspective is the customs union. We have talked a little bit already about the rules of origin problem, and I think here is an area which deserves much more attention and interest in the months and years going forward. And the reason is very much the value-added networks that have been already mentioned. This is something that relies on goods moving back and forth over borders, often multiple times. And if you now enter a situation where you have a free trade agreement with Europe, then you would have to show the origin or prove the origin of a good whenever it crosses the border to qualify for a preferential tariff. Now, we have tons of empirical evidence, a lot of studies that show that this proof of origin is costly. It comes with a lot of red tape. It leads to distortions in the sourcing patterns of firms. So if you need to meet, a 50% value added content requirement, you might change your supplier to meet this objective. And the important thing to notice here is that in many, many cases, the external tariffs of partners in free trade agreements are actually very, very similar. If they are identical, countries that form an FTA are de facto in a customs union. And so we call this a customs union in disguise, right? Or a camouflaged customs union. And empirically, that is very often the case, in particular if you look at deep and comprehensive FTAs. And it will be automatically the case if the if the UK is grandfathering its tariff schedules that the EU has in the WTO relative to the other countries. Now, if the external tariffs are the same, economically, there's no reason whatsoever why you should actually demand a proof of origin. And so I think that's something that I'd like to push in this discussion, that we could maybe do without this proof of origin to the extent that the external tariffs are the same. And of course, then later, as maybe the UK is negotiating different agreements, there will be differences in the external tariffs. But for the time being, if there are none, no reason to have a proof of origin. The second problem that occurs, of course, once you leave the customs union, is that there are customs controls again. And here too, I think there are many ways of how you could administer this, from complicated, bureaucratic to paperless and more or less automatized. I think there's innovative ideas around that should be used here. Now, when it comes to other areas that are not, covering tariffs, but rather anti-Bs or services, I think, of course, there is the financial services area where, much that I hear from the European Parliament, for example, or from the European Commission, it doesn't sound very good. So there is a lot of positioning going on where countries try to secure parts and pieces of the business that's going to leave the UK. So many cities are already drawing up incentive plans to make business move to Europe. It will also be part of the threat point of the European Commission, to do more or to do what they can to lure business from the city to Frankfurt, Milan, Amsterdam, Dublin, Frankfurt. The same is true for the automotive industry. So there too, Japanese car manufacturers could be incentivized to move into Europe, and Europe will certainly try to put something together to make this more likely. One issue that I think is worth mentioning is investment policy. Now, investment chapters are part of EU trade agreements since the Lisbon Treaty, so since 2009. Highly controversial. And the question is whether something like that can be negotiated in the Brexit agreement. But I think there must be something like that to protect both British interests in Europe and European interests in the UK. How to make that go down with the public who doesn't like this is a very big issue. It could be at the end that such a deal doesn't go through the parliaments or even not go through the European Parliament. Finally, I think because the EU public is actually relatively hostile right now against free trade agreements of all sorts. The CETA agreement has a hard time. It's not easy to see how a deep and comprehensive trade agreement with the UK can be done smoothly by technocrats in Brussels without involving big public debates about very fundamental things. And so it can become very toxic. It will be a mixed agreement with all these ratification issues coming along. And I think there are two things that are important for Britain. One is that that even if there is no economic case to bring to really bundle together the four liberties, we can very well imagine that we have a trade agreement that involves goods, services, capital, but has restrictions in worker mobility. That's the case with the Canada agreement or Korea agreements. That would be possible. However, if you want to get the deal through, one veto power is enough, be it Poland or Slovakia or one of the Baltic republics. So that makes even the migration issue, even if Germany, for example, would be relaxed and may even have very similar policy objectives in this area. In Germany too, there is a lot of discussion how to make sure that there's no welfare shopping and these sort of things. But given how the EU operates right now, it will be very, very difficult, I think, for the UK to limit the free mobility of workers. The danger is that a single country will use a veto. And the other area, which is very sensitive, is systems competition. And I think there too, when there is May said that the UK will have to look for a different business model, that went down very badly in many European capitals, in particular in Berlin, with people like Wolfgang Schäuble, who doesn't like the idea of tax competition and of competition in standards, for example, in financial regulation. And I think if the UK is moving there, this could very easily be understood as an aggressive, non-cooperative move that fires back in the negotiations of whatever it is, a transition agreement or some final settlement. And I'll leave it there. Thanks for your attention.
Ali.
Yes. Hello. It's interesting to me that particularly with the US, and this is an evidence of how the referendum is and will be coloring things for a long time going forward, that you had the camp of people who really didn't give a hoot about TTIP, who should have, because very often it tends to be the Conservative Party, very often the people who were very, very sort of pro-free trade, sometimes have ended up being Eurosceptics, so they didn't really care much about TTIP. There was no interest in promoting the EU's role in trade agreements. So you now have a switch whereby the people who really didn't either were agnostic, apathetic, or sometimes in some cases, which I was quite horrified by, sort of would co-opt some of the TTIP critics' arguments. I've now switched to sort of thinking all these trade agreements are the best thing since sliced bread. But I'm also seeing the other way around, and this is in the sense that there are a lot of people who were very much for free trade agreements, were very much in favor of remaining in the EU, and now seem to be very, very, I wouldn't say skeptical, but hesitant. And I think that is both sort of in equal measure genuine caution, but also I think people don't like this idea that the people who were anti-free trade when we were in the EU are now very much in favor of it, and I think sort of ad hominem attacks tend to sort of guide a lot of people's thinking on this, sadly. So I'm going to try and, with myself, and ask people in the room to sort of leave aside how you voted in the referendum, what you thought on the referendum, and try and treat this idea on its merits. Luckily for myself and you all, I just finished a submission to the International Trade Committee for the IOD on priorities for US-UK deal. There were a few other business groups who didn't want to, and that's also reflective of something that we're urging government, is in the sense that we really need, as a business, the business community, a steer from government on when it comes to trade deals that are either ongoing, have just been ratified but are not in place yet, have yet to be ratified or concluded. We really need a steer from the government on what basket it's putting its eggs in, because there's just for our own sort of limited resources about our involvement with engaging with trade negotiations, there's just no point in putting them in, both in TTIP and then a bilateral deal. But I think that with respect to the US, and in case there's anyone from the government here, I do have a UK passport, I am allowed to be here. With respect to the US, I think it's pretty clear, even though that we made very evident that TTIP would have been a much preferable deal just from the point of view of squaring the circle between the US, the UK, and the EU, that particularly with the advent of the new administration, I don't think it's going anywhere. I was surprised by the degree of frankness from Cecilia Malmström, the EU Trade Commissioner, saying that it's being put in the freezer for some time. So I think with that in mind, I think we really do have to turn to what are the priorities for a US-UK deal and when, and our sort of narratives very much proceed, but very much with caution. And that's because there are some things that are, this is sort of a mix of, I think, political and legal issues. You have some people who are talking about doing a quick and, for lack of a better word, dirty deal with the US, which would probably just look at tariffs, which would end up probably having the US having vastly improved access to the UK market, and then the US opening its own, basically lowering its own agricultural tariffs probably over a period of like 20 years. So it would be pretty imbalanced. So I think that Jim was right when he talked about, certainly when it comes to building up
negotiating experience, and it's probably better to go with the smaller countries first. Although I think that there is an assumption in this country that, particularly from the right, that businesses are going to be just as supportive as they were, or the idea of them being supportive of trade agreements, and in fact, from being probably not surprisingly at the NFU conference, speaking to them about 2 weeks ago. I mean, I think they're a little bit more moderate than people expect farmers, generally speaking, to be, but there is quite a bit of concern about that. So, I mean, it's interesting from being at a couple of working group meetings in Whitehall with other sectors. I mean, we're a cross-sector body with lots of different sectors. You start to see sort of a preview of that producer-consuming industry tug of war that really didn't exist here. It was sort of migrated, obviously, to Brussels. That's where all the debates were hashed out. And also, generally speaking, I think enthusiasm for free trade agreements in the UK, I think we've over-egged how supportive the public is. I was quite surprised by how easy it was to maneuver public opinion against TTIP. I always saw TTIP, anti-TTIP signs outside of my underground station. And so maybe we should just not use big acronyms. I think we should call them trade agreements rather than sort of, TTIP or TPA, because I just think that sometimes it sounds cosmetic, but anytime you get a sort of a big name acronym like that, people start getting very skeptical of it. In terms of priorities, I mean, I think that one of the benefits of having been party to TTIP is that we have a formula with which to try and sort of look at with respect to the US. I don't think there's anything wrong with, creating all of these working parties that the Secretary of State, Liam Fox, is doing. Some people would say that, I think one of the difficulties that he and the government has is that everyone wants him to justify the purpose of his department, and the only metric that they're using to use by that with that is what progress have you made on a free trade agreement, so that I can basically turn around and laugh about the fact that you're not able to do anything. I think we need to move away from that a little bit, because that's where the referendum starts to continue to color a lot of our perspectives on this. So I think there's nothing wrong with setting up a working party with the US to start looking at what are the areas, not so much in sort of scoping, because that's quite a formal mechanism, and I think until that our sort of WTO baseline commitments are really sorted out, you can't really promise anything. You can't even talk about, well, I promise you that this is what my schedule is going to look like, but I hope. It depends on what the final outcome is. And I think that there is that, we don't have Robert Lighthizer, who is the Trump's nominee. He hasn't even been confirmed yet. So I think that there will be some pulling back of the US to try and explain how negotiations tend to work, particularly when it comes to the EU element, because I'm very nervous about the UK being put in a position where it's really forced to choose between EU and US standards, but it looks like that's probably going to happen anyways. Looking at our own membership, when we asked them what the priorities we thought for negotiations were, I mean, it was 5-1 was when we gave them sort of options of the EU countries with which we have trade deals through the EU that effectively need to be either grandfathered or redone, renegotiated, and then sort of countries like the US. I mean, it was 5-1. The EU's was the main priority. So we're very clear that we shouldn't be doing anything to undermine our negotiations with the US. The difficulty becomes, what does undermine mean? Does it mean not undertaking any informal discussions with the EU? I'm quite curious about whether it's interesting. You have the competition commissioner, Vestager, apparently saying that she wants to investigate this idea that the letter that was given to Nissan, for example, even though in theory it has nothing to do with the EU if it's talking about post-Brexit life, I wonder if the European Commission will ask this for the same assurances from the UK government about what discussions it's undertaking with the US. But I do think that sort of we need to sort of, there are ways to do that don't involve megaphone diplomacy, and that's very much a political consideration. I don't think going around and saying that we have all these deals that are going to be ready to sign on the day after we leave is particularly helpful. I think that we could learn a thing or two from the Canadians in this respect. They're very cautious in the way that they talk about trade deals in public. Having said that, there's quite a few things that we can do now which would make a big impact, but they are things that we always could have done, which are not only in the area of trade promotion, but for example, the US still has, the Department of Agriculture is starting to look at lifting its ban on Irish and UK beef. But for example, there's always been a ban on sheep's lung, which most people will know as haggis. Those are things that you can work on at a bilateral level with the US to try and get lifted now. And I don't think that they should be dismissed just because they don't amount to a full-scale trade deal. But in terms of setting all those aside, looking at what do we want out of a US-UK deal, the procurement market the US is still very, very closed, despite the fact that the US is the #1 single country market for our members. When I talk to them about what are the issues, very often there are things that potentially might not be able to be dealt with in a trade deal, and that's divergence between states, for example, on collateral requirements for reinsurance, for example. But otherwise, in public procurement, it's a very closed market. I do think, for example, in financial services, that an administration can make a difference in terms of what it tells the regulators, because there was a U.S. Treasury Secretary before, under Obama, who was very resistant to this idea of including any discussion on regulatory cooperation in TTIP, despite the fact that you had industries both in Europe and in the US pushing them to do so. So in theory, I think that you could actually make more progress on that. The question is that really the best place to talk about it? So the issue from the European standpoint is that you had this financial markets regulatory dialogue that was supposed to do that job, but hadn't really done much since the 2008-2009. And I think that might be something that to be done outside of a trade agreement, not a sort of sector-specific financial services deal, but in the way that, for example, the US and the EU recently reached a deal on recognizing each other's specific rules on derivatives clearing. That is something that could probably be done outside of a trade agreement, but what you could have done through a trade agreement is setting up the framework for that bilateral regulatory cooperation going forward. I think there's a lot to have learned to learn from TTIP. I mean, the Commission, I think, was we'll learn very quickly that a lot of our offensive interests are very much the same as the EU's. We just have probably a few less defensive interests, and it's not as difficult to get some of these trade agreements through, which I do think puts a plus in the category, in the UK's category, for being able to do some of these trade agreements. The more tricky area is around sanitary and phytosanitary standards. So it was interesting when I was at the NFU conference, in the NFU president's speech, which got a big rousting cheer, was talking about we don't want hormone-treated beef in our markets. I think that there's a case independently of an FTA to when we're starting to look at not just agricultural support, but agricultural policy generally speaking, to consult with industry and consumers to figure out, is this something that is an absolute no-go? I don't like this idea of shutting down debate completely. And if it's established that they really do want to keep those European standards, which I can certainly, from listening to the people in the hall, they do, then we have to say to the US, listen, and this is what the same thing was going to happen in TTIP. I think people are terrified of this idea of talking about mutual recognition of standards. A lot of what trade agreements do is trying to look at the set of standards. It's the whole point of having all of these annexes, to figure out where you do agree, where you can recognize each other's, and where you don't want to. I do think the US probably is hoping that outside of the EU, the UK will change its model in this respect. I don't think that's particularly very likely to happen. And that's where I think TTIP would have been much more preferable, is you don't have this question about if, for example, the UK was to completely change its GMO licensing procedures. You could do a deal with the US in this respect, but then does that automatically shut off your access to the European market? Even if farming in this country decided that it wanted to have look at sort of changing the way that it raises its livestock, produces its livestock. If we do a deal with the US in that respect, there's just no point with our biggest market. It's going to shut it down if there's no discussion over that. And it's interesting, when I was going into the NFU conference, there was these protests outside of the building from the badger cull people. And I think people forget sometimes that one of the reasons that you have a badger cull is because you can't do cattle vaccination because of European rules around how you do sort of skin testing to make sure, distinguish which cattle is infected, which is not. So this is sort of analogous to the example that I just mentioned, because there is a lot that the UK could do outside of the EU to try and develop such a skin test, but then if you can't export it to your biggest market, that almost renders it a little bit meaningless to a certain extent. So these are some of the issues, I think, when it comes to making sure that we have a clear understanding with the EU about to what degree we will cooperate on regulatory standards going forward has to be set out first. Having said that, I was in Geneva last week to see the WTO and the EFTA Secretariat. this whole idea of overlapping standard systems is not something new to trade agreements. Norway, Iceland, etc. These are in EFTA. These are in the single market. They do respect single market rules, not just on services, but on technical standards for goods trade. And yet they have done agreements with China. They are doing negotiations with India. So I think there's something to be learned there for how do you, leaving aside services because they don't really do a lot of unlocking of new services market, but particularly on technical barriers to trade in goods. There's something to be learned from how do they deal with this kind of clash of not making sure that they basically don't do anything that would jeopardize their participation in the single market. I think there's something to be learned there. E-commerce, I've already had quite a few outbound inquiries from groups in the US to sort of look at how can they do agreements to recognize each other's standards on data, not so much standards on data flows, but trying to put down limitations on restrictions to data flows. So there's a lot of interest there. And then just quickly coming to investment and ISDS. We were always, I often found myself arguing against people who were anti-TTIP on the basis of ISDS. I thought there was a lot of myths out there about what it's used for, how it's used, etc., what kind of firms use it. The OECD says a quarter of the firms who use it are not multinationals. Having said that, we were always a bit more sanguine about whether it should be included or not, which is not to say that we didn't want it, but I remember being asked by the business committee, would we live without a ISDS in the agreement, and our answer was we were perfectly happy. I just think we'll find out very quickly as a sort of middle-ranking negotiating and economic power doing a deal with the US, we may not have the choice in that respect. So,
thank you very much.